Welcome back to Calm Art Studio. This is episode 2 in our quiet series on the life of Claude Monet. In this episode, we remain with Monet during years of uncertainty. Years when his way of seeing did not fit the expectations around him. Years marked by rejection, displacement, and the steady decision to continue working anyway. Nothing here arrives quickly. Nothing resolves. You may listen closely, or you may simply let the words pass by. There is no need to remember names or dates. There is no need to follow every detail. If you find these quiet stories helpful for rest or reflection, you are welcome to like this video or subscribe to the channel. Doing so helps this calm space continue. You may also share or leave a comment about where you are listening from if that feels comfortable. Now, settle in. We begin again with Claude Monet as he continues choosing light over approval and remains with the work day after day. Paris was different from Le Havre in ways that were not immediately obvious. The city was larger, denser, more contained. The light came down between buildings rather than across open water. The air smelled different. It smelled of stone and cooking and the particular staleness that comes from many people living close together. It did not smell of salt or fog or the clean dampness of coastal weather. Monet arrived as a young man who had learned something on the beaches of Normandy, something about light and observation, something about standing still and looking. But Paris did not ask him what he had learned. Paris had its own ideas about what painting should be. The city was full of institutions. Schools, academies, salons, galleries. Places where art was made official, where it was judged, where it was given value or denied it. These institutions had existed for centuries. They had developed rules, principles, hierarchies. They knew what art was. They knew what subjects were worthy and what subjects were not. They knew what techniques demonstrated skill and what techniques demonstrated a failure to master the necessary disciplines. The Académie des Beaux-Arts stood at the center of this system. It was the official authority on art in France. It trained painters according to principles that had been refined over generations. It held competitions. It awarded prizes. It determined who could exhibit in the Salon, the annual exhibition that functioned as the primary gateway to a career in painting. Around this central institution were smaller studios, private ateliers where established painters took on students. These studios varied in their strictness, but they all operated within the same basic framework. They taught drawing from plaster casts before allowing students to work from live models. They emphasized careful composition, smooth finish, subjects drawn from history or mythology or allegory. They prepared students to submit work to the Salon, to compete for recognition within the official system. Monet enrolled at the Académie Suisse. It was not part of the official system. It was an informal space, a room where you could pay a small fee and work from a model without formal instruction, without examinations, without the heavy structure of academic training. It attracted painters who were serious but uncertain, who wanted to work but did not want to be told exactly how to work. Monet went there. He drew from the model. He watched other young painters working. He listened to conversations about technique, about composition, about what the Salon jury was accepting that year, and what they were rejecting. But he found himself restless. The instruction, Even the minimal instruction available at the Académie Suisse felt restrictive. Not because it was harsh or cruel, but because it asked him to approach painting in a way that did not match what he had learned on the beaches with Boudin. It asked him to construct images according to established principles. It asked him to think about composition as something separate from observation, something you built, rather than something you found. He had learned something different. He had learned that painting could begin with looking. That you could stand in front of a subject and respond to it directly, without first deciding what it should look like, without imposing a structure from outside. But Paris did not seem interested in this approach. The official standards were clear. A painting should be carefully finished. The brushstrokes should not be visible. The surface should be smooth, the transitions between colors gradual and controlled. The subject should be elevated, drawn from sources that carried cultural weight. History, mythology, important moments from literature or religion. Or, if the subject was contemporary, it should be rendered in a way that elevated it, that gave it dignity and permanence. A landscape was acceptable if it was composed like a stage set, with clear foreground, middle ground, and background, with trees arranged in pleasing patterns, with light that created a harmonious overall effect. But a landscape that simply showed what you saw when you stood in a particular place at a particular time, that captured the light as it actually appeared, without arrangement or idealization. This was not considered serious work. Monet painted anyway. He left the Académie Suisse and went outside. He walked through Paris, looking at the light. He noticed how it changed, depending on the hour, the season, the weather. He noticed how the same street looked entirely different in morning light than in afternoon light. He noticed how fog softened the edges of buildings, how rain made the pavements reflect the sky, how winter light had a clarity that summer light did not have. He began to paint what he saw, not what he thought should be there, not what academic training told him to emphasize or arrange, just what was actually there, in that moment, under that light. It was difficult work. The light changed quickly. By the time he had mixed a color and applied it to the canvas, the light had already shifted, and the color no longer looked right. He had to work faster than he was used to working. He had to make decisions quickly, trusting his first impression rather than deliberating endlessly. He had to accept that what he painted would be incomplete, that it would capture a moment rather than a timeless scene, that it would show the particular conditions of a particular day rather than an idealized version of how things generally looked. This was not what Paris expected from painters. The city had its routines, its standards, its established ways of determining what was valuable and what was not. And Monet was moving further and further from those standards, not because he was trying to rebel, but because he was following what he had learned, what his eye told him, what seemed true when he stood outside and looked. He spent long days walking through the city, down to the river, where the Seine moved slowly through Paris, reflecting sky and buildings and bridges. Through parks and gardens, where trees cast shadows that changed shape as the sun moved across the sky. Through streets, where light came down in narrow bands between tall buildings, creating sharp contrasts, deep shadows, sudden brightness. He painted the river many times. The same stretch of water, the same view, but each time it looked different. The water was blue on some days, gray on others, green in certain light. The reflections changed. Sometimes they were clear and sharp. Every detail of the buildings above mirrored perfectly in the water below. Other times they were broken, fragmented by the movement of the current, by wind disturbing the surface, by boats passing through. He painted the same bridge over and over, trying to capture not the structure of the bridge, but the way light fell across it, the way shadows gathered underneath it, the way the water looked as it passed beneath the arches. Each painting was different because each day was different. The light was never the same twice. This repetition was not common practice. Most painters chose a subject, painted it once, and moved on. The goal was to produce a finished work, a statement, something that could stand on its own as a complete artistic achievement. The idea of returning to the same subject again and again, painting it under different conditions, capturing its variations rather than its essential permanent form, this was not part of the academic tradition. But Monet was not painting to produce finished works. He was painting to understand something. To understand how light worked, how color changed in relation to other colors, how the eye perceived not isolated objects, but relationships, patterns, the way everything shifted together depending on atmospheric conditions. He painted slowly in the sense that he returned to the same subjects repeatedly, but he painted quickly in the sense that each individual session was fast, urgent, driven by the need to capture a moment before it passed. The two speeds existed together, the long, patient return and the quick, immediate response. Paris continued around him. The city did not notice his work. The official institutions did not pay attention. He was one of many young painters trying to find a way forward, and most of them would fail, would give up, would return to provincial towns or find other work. He lived simply. A small room somewhere in the city. Basic furniture. Just enough space for his materials, for the canvases that accumulated as he painted day after day. He did not have money for anything more. Painting materials were expensive. Canvas, brushes, pigments. He used what he had carefully, mixing his colors on small palettes, working on modest-sized canvases that he could carry easily when he went outside to paint. He ate simply. Bread, cheese, whatever was cheap and available. He did not go to cafes or restaurants. He could not afford that. He spent what little money he had on paint, on canvas, on the materials he needed to continue working. The days followed a pattern. He woke early. Light was best in the morning, before the sun was high, when shadows were long and colors were cool and clear. He gathered his materials, his easel, his palette, his brushes. He walked to wherever he had decided to work that day. He set up his easel. He looked. Looking took time. Before he began painting, he stood and looked. He watched how the light was falling, where the shadows were, what colors were present in the scene. Not the colors he expected to see, but the colors that were actually there. The light changed, what colors appeared. A building that was gray stone might look blue in shadow, violet in certain conditions, warm and golden in late afternoon light. He had to see what was actually there, rather than what he knew was there. Then he began painting, mixing colors, applying them quickly, building up the surface of the canvas stroke by stroke. Each stroke was a decision: where to place it, what color to make it, how much paint to use, what direction to move the brush. Thousands of small decisions, made rapidly, guided by observation, by the need to respond to what was in front of him before it changed. The light changed. Always it changed. The sun moved across the sky. Clouds came and went. The shadows shifted. What had looked right 10 minutes ago no longer looked right now. He had to work faster, or accept that what he was painting was already gone, that he was capturing something that no longer existed, except in his eye, in his memory of what he had just seen. Sometimes people walked past and watched him work. They did not understand what he was doing. The painting did not look like the scene in front of them. It looked rough, unfinished, the brushstrokes visible, the surface textured and uneven. They expected a painting to look smooth, polished, like a photograph, like a clear window onto reality. But what Monet was making looked different. It looked like paint. It looked like an accumulation of marks, of colors placed beside each other, overlapping, building up into something that suggested the scene without reproducing it exactly. Sometimes, other painters came and talked with him. They asked what he was trying to do. He explained, or tried to explain, that he was trying to paint what he saw, not what was there. That there was a difference between the object and the appearance of the object, between the permanent form and the temporary effect of light on that form. Some understood. Some did not. Some argued with him, telling him that painting was about more than just recording appearances, that it was about interpreting, about finding the essential truth beneath the surface variation, about creating something permanent and meaningful rather than just capturing a passing moment. He listened, but he did not change his approach. He continued painting outside, painting the same subjects repeatedly, painting quickly to catch the light, building up canvases that recorded not objects, but moments, not things, but the way things appeared under particular conditions. The pressure to conform was always present. Not dramatic pressure. Not someone standing over him, telling him to stop. But the quieter pressure of knowing that what he was doing would not be accepted by the official institutions, that the salon jury would likely reject his work, that galleries would not be interested, that collectors would not buy paintings that looked unfinished, that showed visible brushstrokes, that depicted ordinary subjects without elevation or idealization. He knew that other young painters who followed the academic path were beginning to have success. They submitted work to the salon. Some of them were accepted. Their paintings were hung in the exhibition, seen by thousands of people, reviewed by critics. They began to sell their work. They received commissions. They started to build careers. Monet did not have this. His work was not accepted. He submitted paintings to the salon, and they were rejected. The jury looked at his rough surfaces, his visible brushstrokes, his ordinary subjects, and they saw a failure to master the necessary skills. They saw someone who had not learned to finish his work properly, who was either lazy or incompetent. But he continued. He woke early. He gathered his materials. He walked through Paris to the places where he wanted to work. He set up his easel. He looked. He painted. He worked until the light changed too much, until what he was trying to capture was gone. Then he packed up his materials and walked back through the city to his small room. He cleaned his brushes. He looked at what he had painted. Sometimes it seemed close to what he had seen. Sometimes it did not. Sometimes he felt he had learned something, understood something new about how to mix a particular color or how to suggest depth with overlapping strokes. Sometimes he felt he had gone backward, that what he had painted was worse than what he had painted the week before. This was part of the work. The uncertainty, the sense that progress was not steady, not guaranteed. That you could work for months and feel you were getting further from understanding rather than closer to it. He had no teacher to tell him he was doing well, no official validation, no external measure of success. He had only his own eye, his own sense of whether what he was making matched what he had seen, whether it captured something true about the light, the atmosphere, the particular quality of a moment. During these years, Paris was full of painters. Young men, mostly, who had come to the city to study, to learn, to try to make careers in art. They lived in small rooms like Monet's room. They worked in studios, in ateliers, at the Académie Suisse, or other informal spaces. They submitted work to the salon. They hoped to be accepted, to be noticed, to begin the long process of building a reputation. Most of them would not succeed. The official art world was small. There were only so many positions, so many opportunities. The salon accepted hundreds of paintings each year, but thousands were submitted. Even being accepted once did not guarantee a career. You had to be accepted repeatedly. You had to receive favorable reviews. You had to attract patrons, collectors, people willing to pay for your work. And even then, success was uncertain. You could be popular for a few years and then fall out of favor. You could paint in a style that was celebrated one decade and dismissed the next. The art world shifted. What seemed important one year seemed irrelevant 5 years later. Monet was not thinking about success in those terms. He was thinking about how to paint water. How to capture the way light moved across a surface that was constantly moving, constantly changing. How to mix the right gray, the right blue, the right green. How to suggest reflection without making it too literal, too detailed. How to make a painting that conveyed the feeling of standing beside the river at a particular moment on a particular day. These were technical problems. Practical problems. They required patient experiment. They required trying the same thing many times, failing most of the time, learning slowly what worked and what did not work. He painted the river in morning light. The water was calm, reflective, almost mirror-like. The buildings on the far bank appeared clearly in the water below, their forms doubled, slightly distorted, but recognizable. He painted the river in afternoon light. The sun was higher. The water looked different. The colors were warmer. The reflections were less clear because the light was coming from a different angle, because the surface of the water was disturbed by a slight breeze. He painted the river in overcast conditions. The sky was gray. The water was gray. But not the same gray. The water was darker, cooler, more opaque. The reflections were muted. The whole scene had a different feeling, quiet, subdued. The colors held in a narrow range. Everything soft and close. Each painting taught him something about color, about the way the eye mixed colors when they were placed beside each other, about the way a single stroke of bright paint could change the feeling of an entire passage, about the way shadows were not simply dark versions of the colors around them, but had their own color, their own temperature, cool or warm, depending on the light. He learned slowly. Each day added something small to his understanding. Each painting was an increment, a tiny step toward being able to see more clearly, to translate what he saw more accurately, to respond more quickly and surely to the changing conditions in front of him. But there was no moment of revelation, no sudden understanding, no day when everything became clear and the work became easy. It remained difficult. Always it remained difficult. The challenge of trying to capture something that was moving, changing, disappearing, even as you tried to paint it. The knowledge that what you made would always be incomplete, always a partial record, always falling short of the full complexity of what you saw. The pressure to conform did not come from any single source. It came from the fact that the official institutions existed, that they had power, that they determined what was seen and valued. It came from conversations with other painters who were following the academic path, who questioned why Monet was working the way he was working, who suggested he would have more success if he painted more finished work, more elevated subjects, more carefully composed scenes. It came from the simple reality of needing to sell paintings in order to continue buying materials, in order to eat, in order to keep working. And the paintings he was making were not easy to sell. They did not look like what people expected paintings to look like. They looked rough, sketchy, preliminary. People saw them and thought they were studies, preparatory work for a more finished painting that would come later. But for Monet, these were not studies. They were the work itself. The quick response to a particular moment was the goal, not a step toward something else. This was hard to explain, hard to defend. When people asked why the painting looked unfinished, he did not have an answer that satisfied them. He could say that this was what he saw, that this was how the light appeared, that finishing it more would mean losing the immediacy, the freshness, the sense of a lived moment. But this did not make sense to people who believed that a painting should be permanent, polished, resolved. He continued anyway. He walked through Paris. He painted the river, the bridges, the parks. He painted on days when the light was clear and on days when the light was diffuse. He painted in all seasons, watching how winter light was different from summer light, how spring had its own particular quality, soft and new, how autumn light was richer, warmer, more golden. He lived simply. He worked constantly. He did not go out in the evenings. He did not socialize. He spent his time painting or preparing to paint, cleaning his materials, stretching canvases, mixing pigments, organizing his small workspace. Other young painters had social lives. They went to cafes. They talked late into the night about art and politics and philosophy. They formed friendships, networks, groups that supported each other. Monet was not entirely isolated. He knew other painters. He talked with them sometimes. But he did not have the energy or the interest for constant social engagement. He was focused on the work, on the daily practice of going out and looking and trying to paint what he saw. The academic institutions continued to define what art should be. They held their exhibitions. They awarded their prizes. They published their standards in books and treatises that explained the principles of composition, the importance of drawing, the hierarchy of subjects. History painting at the top, portrait painting below that, landscape and still life at the bottom. These hierarchies were not just aesthetic preferences. They were economic realities. History paintings sold for more money. They attracted more attention. They were what museums wanted to acquire, what important collectors wanted to own. A painter who wanted a successful career needed to work within this system, needed to produce the kind of work that the system valued, needed to submit to the salon, needed to be accepted repeatedly, needed to build a reputation that would lead to commissions, sales, security. Monet was not doing this. He was painting rivers and bridges. He was painting ordinary days, ordinary light. He was painting quickly, roughly, leaving the brushstrokes visible. He was making work that the official system did not know what to do with, work that did not fit the established categories, work that looked like it was still in progress rather than complete. He submitted paintings anyway. Each year, he gathered some of his work and submitted it to the salon jury. Each year, he waited to hear whether it had been accepted. Most years, it was rejected. The rejection was not accompanied by explanation. The jury did not tell you why your work had been refused. They simply sent a notice. Your painting had not been accepted. That was all. You could try to guess why. You could imagine what the jury had thought when they looked at your work. That it was too rough, too unfinished. The subject was too ordinary. The technique was too loose. The whole thing looked like a sketch rather than a proper painting. But you did not know for certain. You only knew that your work had been refused, that it would not be seen by the thousands of people who attended the salon, that it would not be reviewed by critics, that it would not have a chance to be purchased by collectors. You could return to your small room. You could look at the rejected painting. And you could decide whether to change your approach, to try to make work that would be accepted, or to continue as you had been continuing, following what your eye told you, what your instinct told you, even if it meant more rejection, more isolation, more years of working without recognition or support. Monet continued. He painted the same bridge again. He painted the same stretch of river. He painted in morning light and afternoon light and overcast light. He painted in spring when the trees were just beginning to leaf out, in summer when the foliage was full and heavy, in autumn when the leaves were turning, in winter when the branches were bare. Each painting was different. Each one captured a particular moment, a particular arrangement of light and weather and season. Each one was an attempt to understand something about how light worked, how color worked, how to translate the experience of standing in a place and looking into paint on canvas. The work accumulated, canvas after canvas, some better than others, some that seemed to capture something close to what he had seen, some that missed entirely, that fell flat, that did not convey the quality he had been trying to capture. He kept them all, even the failures. He looked at them. He tried to understand what had worked and what had not worked. Why one painting felt alive and another felt dead. Why one captured the feeling of a moment, and another felt empty, just marks on canvas, with no connection to the living world. This analysis was part of the work. The painting itself was only half of it. The other half was looking at what you had made, trying to understand it, trying to learn from it, so that the next painting might be better, might get closer to what you were trying to do. But better at what? That was the question he could not entirely answer. Better at capturing the light. Better at suggesting atmosphere. Better at creating a surface that looked right, that felt right, that conveyed something true about the experience of seeing. These were vague terms. They were not the language of academic painting. Academic painting had clear standards. You could measure a painting against those standards. You could say whether the drawing was accurate, whether the composition was balanced, whether the finish was properly smooth and controlled. But Monet was working toward something that did not have clear standards. Something subjective, experiential, based on a feeling that a painting was right or not right. This made it hard to explain his work to others. Hard to defend it. Hard to argue that he was succeeding when his paintings did not meet any of the established criteria for success. He walked through Paris at different times of day. Early morning, when the city was just waking. The streets were quiet. The light was cool and clear. Shopkeepers were opening their doors, setting out goods, sweeping the pavement in front of their establishments. Workers were walking to their jobs, moving through the streets in small groups or alone, their faces still marked by sleep. Mid-morning, when the city was fully awake. Traffic in the streets. Carriages moving, horses pulling wagons loaded with goods. People walking on every sidewalk, going about their business, entering shops, standing in groups talking. The light was higher now, more even, the shadows shorter. Late afternoon, when the light began to change. The sun was lower. The shadows were longer. The quality of the light was different, warmer, more golden. People moved differently at this hour. They were tired. The day was nearly done. They were walking home, or to cafes, or to meet friends. Evening, when the light faded. The city took on a different character. Lamps were lit inside shops and homes. Windows glowed. The streets were darker, but not empty. People still moved through them, but more slowly, more quietly. The atmosphere changed. The day receded. Night approached. Monet watched all of this. He was always watching. Even when he was not painting, even when he was just walking through the city without his materials, he was looking. Noticing how the light fell, how shadows gathered in doorways, how the wet pavement reflected the sky after rain, how fog moved through streets, making everything soft and uncertain. This constant observation was its own kind of work. It required attention. It required staying present, staying alert to what was happening around you. It would have been easy to walk through the city without really seeing it, to let it become familiar and therefore invisible, to stop noticing because you had seen it all before. But Monet did not let it become invisible. He kept looking. He kept noticing. He kept finding new things in the same places, new qualities of light, new arrangements of shadow and color, new moments that seemed worth trying to paint. The academic institutions did not care about these moments. They cared about grand subjects, important scenes, paintings that told stories, or illustrated moral lessons, or commemorated significant events. They cared about technical mastery, demonstrated through smooth finish and accurate drawing. They cared about paintings that looked permanent, substantial, worthy of being hung in museums and important collections. They did not care about a particular moment on an ordinary day when the light happened to fall in a certain way across the water of the Seine. That was not important. That was not what painting was for. But for Monet, that moment was everything. That particular quality of light, that specific arrangement of color and tone, that feeling of standing there and seeing something beautiful and fleeting and impossible to hold except by trying to paint it. That was what painting was for. The gap between these two ideas was vast. There was no compromise between them. You could not serve both. You could not paint grand historical subjects with smooth finish and also paint quick impressions of ordinary light. They required different approaches, different techniques, different ideas about what mattered. Monet had chosen, or perhaps he had not chosen, but simply found himself unable to paint any other way. The beaches with Boudin had shaped him. The harbor light of Le Havre had shaped him. He had learned to see a certain way, and now he could not unsee it. He could not pretend that the official subjects and techniques were what interested him. So he continued outside this system, working alone mostly, painting rivers and bridges, submitting to the salon and being rejected, living simply, barely scraping by, uncertain whether what he was doing would ever be recognized, whether anyone would ever care about these paintings of ordinary light, whether he was wasting years of his life pursuing something that had no place in the world of art as it existed. But he could not stop. He had to continue. The light continued to change. The river continued to flow. The seasons continued to turn. And he continued to stand beside the water with his easel, trying to capture something that was always moving, always changing, always just beyond his ability to fully grasp. The tension did not resolve. The official standards did not change. The academic institutions continued as they had always continued. The salon jury continued to reject work that did not meet their criteria. Collectors continued to buy work that looked finished and elevated and proper. And Monet continued to paint the river. Monet submitted works to the Paris Salon multiple times. Each submission was an act that required preparation. Not just the preparation of the painting itself, but the preparation of hope, the gathering of resolve, the acceptance that what followed might be rejection. He would select a painting from those he had completed. He would look at it in his small room, trying to see it as the jury would see it, trying to imagine their response. The painting would be packed carefully, wrapped in cloth to protect the surface, carried through the streets to the building where submissions were received. There would be other painters there, other young men carrying their work, all hoping for acceptance, all knowing that most would be refused. The painting would be handed over. A receipt would be given. And then there was nothing to do But wait. The waiting lasted weeks. During this time, Monet continued his daily routine. He walked through Paris. He looked at the light. He set up his easel beside the river, or in a park, or on a street corner. He painted. The work continued regardless of what might be happening with the painting he had submitted, regardless of whether it would be accepted or rejected. But the waiting was present. It was there in the background of every day. The knowledge that somewhere a group of men were looking at paintings, making decisions, determining which work would be seen by thousands of people and which work would be returned, unseen, unvalued. The Salon was held annually. It was the primary exhibition of contemporary art in France. To have a painting accepted meant that it would hang in a vast gallery alongside hundreds of other paintings. Critics would attend. They would write reviews. Collectors would come looking for work to purchase. The public would stream through day after day, looking, judging, forming opinions. To be accepted was to have a chance. To be rejected was to remain invisible. Monet received rejections. Not every time, but often. A notice would arrive. Brief, impersonal. His work had not been selected. That was all. No explanation. No indication of what the jury had thought, what they had found lacking, what they had objected to. He would retrieve the painting, carry it back through the streets to his room, unwrap it, look at it again. It was the same painting he had submitted. Nothing about it had changed, but now it carried the weight of refusal. It had been judged and found wanting by the official arbiters of art. Some early submissions were rejected. He continued submitting. Each year, or most years, he gathered work and sent it to the jury. Each time he hoped. Each time he knew that hope was uncertain, that rejection was likely, that the work he was making did not align with what the Salon typically accepted. But he submitted anyway. Because the Salon was the system that existed. Because there was no other comparable way to be seen. Because even if his work did not match what the jury expected, there was always the possibility that they might accept it anyway, might see something in it that overcame their reservations. In 1869, his painting The Magpie was rejected. It was a snow painting. A winter scene. A wooden gate, a magpie perched on it, and beyond the gate, a field covered in snow. The painting was dominated by white tones. Snow filled most of the canvas. The shadows on the snow were blue and violet. The light was clear, cold, the particular light of a winter day when the sun is bright, but the air is frigid. Monet had worked carefully on this painting. He had tried to capture the way light fell across snow, the way shadows appeared not gray, but colored, reflecting the blue of the sky. He had tried to show that white was not a single color, but many colors. Warm in some places where the sun touched it directly, cool in others where it lay in shadow. The Salon jury rejected it. Viewers were not prepared for paintings dominated by white tones. They expected more color. They expected landscapes to have green fields, or blue water, or autumn trees in red and gold. A painting that was mostly white seemed empty, seemed to lack content, seemed to be missing something essential. and the shadows troubled them. Shadows were supposed to be brown or gray, darker versions of the colors around them. But Monet had painted shadows that were blue, violet, even slightly purple in places. This looked wrong to eyes trained by academic principles. It looked like a mistake, like the artist did not understand how shadows worked. But Monet had painted what he saw. He had stood in front of the scene and looked at the snow and the shadows had been blue and violet. The light reflecting off the white snow and down from the blue sky had colored everything. The shadows were not simply an absence of light. They were a different kind of light, cooler, reflected, tinted by the colors around them. The jury did not accept this. They looked at the blue shadows and saw error. They looked at the white-dominated composition and saw emptiness. They rejected the painting. Monet retrieved it. He brought it back to his room. He looked at it. He did not repaint the shadows. He did not add more color to satisfy what viewers expected. The painting remained as it was, a record of what he had seen on a winter day, painted as truthfully as he knew how to paint it. The rejection was not a single event. It was part of a pattern. His paintings were often described as unfinished by critics. When his work was seen, which was not often since much of it was rejected, the response was frequently that the paintings looked like sketches, like preparatory studies, like work that had not yet been brought to completion. The visible brushstrokes troubled viewers. The rough texture of the paint surface troubled them. The lack of smooth blending troubled them. All of these things suggested to the critics that Monet had not learned the proper techniques, that he was either unable or unwilling to finish his work correctly. But for Monet, the paintings were finished. They were complete statements. The visible brushstrokes were intentional. The texture was intentional. The speed of execution was intentional. All of it served the goal of capturing a moment, an impression, a particular quality of light that existed only briefly and would be gone if you worked more slowly or more carefully. To smooth the surface, to blend the brushstrokes, to add more detail would have meant losing what he was trying to capture. The freshness would disappear. The immediacy would disappear. The painting would become something else, something more polished, but less alive. He could not explain this in a way that satisfied the critics. The language did not exist. The concepts were not yet established. He was working towards something that did not have a name, that did not fit into existing categories, that required a different way of thinking about what painting could be. His work was difficult to sell in these years. Galleries were not interested. The paintings looked too rough, too unfinished. Collectors were not interested. They wanted work that looked substantial, that looked like it would hold its value, that fit their understanding of what art should look like. Monet's paintings did not fit this understanding. He had no steady income. He sold a painting occasionally, usually for very little money. Enough to buy more materials, enough to pay for his room for another month, enough to eat simply for a few more weeks, but never enough to feel secure, never enough to stop worrying about money, never enough to allow him to focus entirely on painting without the constant pressure of poverty. Monet experienced ongoing financial instability. It was not a temporary condition. It was the reality of his life during these years. He was always short of money, always uncertain how he would pay for the next canvas, the next tubes of paint, the next week's rent. This instability shaped his days. He could not paint as much as he wanted to paint because materials were expensive. He had to choose carefully what to paint, knowing that each canvas represented money he had spent, money he might not recoup if the painting did not sell. He had to work on smaller canvases than he might have preferred, because smaller meant less expensive. He ate simply. Bread, mostly. Cheese when he could afford it. He did not go to restaurants. He did not buy wine or coffee in cafes. Every franc was measured, counted, allocated to the most essential needs. Painting materials came first. Rent came second. Food came third. Everything else was impossible. Other young painters in Paris had families who supported them. They received money from home, allowances that covered their living expenses while they studied, while they tried to establish themselves. They could afford better rooms, better materials, better food. They could focus on their work without the constant distraction of wondering how they would survive the next month. Monet did not have this support. His family had limited means. They could not send money regularly. He was on his own. He had to make his way through painting, through selling his work, or he had to find other ways to earn money. Work that took time away from painting, work that exhausted him, work that felt like giving up, even though he knew it was necessary. The financial pressure was constant. It was present every day. It colored everything. When he looked at a canvas, he was also calculating its cost. When he mixed paint, he was aware of how much paint remained, how long it would last, how soon he would need to buy more. When he ate his simple meals, he was thinking about how many more days this food would sustain him. This was not the life he had imagined when he first came to Paris. He had known it would be difficult. He had known that most painters struggled. But knowing this abstractly was different from living it, from experiencing the daily grinding worry of poverty, the fear that he might have to give up, might have to return to Le Havre, might have to abandon painting and find work that provided steady income but no fulfillment. Rejection did not prevent him from continuing to work. This was perhaps the most important fact. Despite the rejections from the salon, despite the poverty, despite the criticism that his work was unfinished, despite the difficulty of selling paintings, despite all of it, he continued to paint. He woke each morning. He gathered his materials. He walked through Paris to the places where he wanted to work. He set up his easel. He looked at the light. He painted. The routine was constant. It provided structure to days that might otherwise have felt formless, purposeless. The routine said that painting mattered, that the work was worth doing regardless of whether it was accepted by the salon, regardless of whether it sold, regardless of whether anyone else valued it. He painted the same subjects repeatedly. The river, the bridges, the parks, the streets. He returned to the same locations over and over, watching how they changed, how the light made them different each time he looked. There was a particular stretch of the Seine that he painted many times. He knew every building along it, every tree, every stone of the embankment. But each time he set up his easel there, it looked different. The water was a different color. The sky was different. The reflections were different. The whole scene was transformed by the conditions of that particular day, that particular hour. He painted in all weather. On clear days when the light was sharp and the colors were bright. On overcast days when everything was muted, held in a narrow range of grays and soft blues. On days when rain threatened but had not yet arrived, when the air felt heavy and the light had a strange quality, both dim and intense at the same time. He painted in all seasons. Winter snow, which most painters avoided because it was difficult to work in cold weather, because white was challenging to paint, because winter scenes were not fashionable. Spring growth, the first leaves appearing, the air soft and new. Summer fullness, everything green and lush, the light warm and golden. Autumn decline, the leaves turning, the light becoming richer, more saturated. Each season taught him something different. Each weather condition presented different problems, different challenges. How do you paint fog? How do you suggest heat without using red? How do you capture the particular blue of a winter sky, cold and clear, and somehow sad? These were technical problems, but they were also deeper problems. They were about perception, about learning to see truly, about distinguishing what you actually saw from what you expected to see or thought you should see. He walked through Paris in early morning. The city was quiet. Shop owners were sweeping the pavement in front of their stores. Workers were walking to their jobs, moving quickly through the cool air, their breath visible. The light at this hour was special. It came from a low angle, creating long shadows, making everything look crisp and clear. He walked through Paris at midday. The city was busy. People filled the streets. Carriages moved through traffic. Vendors called out, selling vegetables, bread, flowers. The light was high overhead, even, less interesting than morning light or evening light, but still worth watching, still teaching him something about how light worked when it had less drama, less obvious beauty. He walked through Paris in late afternoon. The light was changing, becoming warmer, becoming more golden. The shadows were lengthening again. People's movements were different at this hour. Slower. More tired. The energy of midday was fading. Evening was approaching. He walked through Paris at dusk. The light was almost gone. The sky held color for a long time after the sun had set, violet and deep blue, sometimes orange or pink near the horizon. Windows began to glow from within. The city transformed. It became softer, quieter, more mysterious. All of these hours, all of these conditions, all of these variations of light, he observed them. He stored them. He tried to paint them, not all at once. He could not paint everything he saw, but he chose moments, chose particular effects that interested him, that seemed to capture something essential about the experience of looking, of being present in a place at a specific time. His room accumulated canvases. They leaned against the walls. They were stacked in corners. Some were finished, or as finished as he considered them. Some were abandoned, attempts that had not worked, that had failed to capture what he had been trying to capture. Some were still wet, recently painted, waiting to dry before he could move them or stack them. The room smelled of oil paint and turpentine. The smell was constant. It was in his clothes, on his hands, in his hair. He was used to it. He barely noticed it anymore. But visitors, when he had visitors, noticed immediately. The sharp chemical smell of the solvents. The oily smell of the paint. The whole room marked by the work that happened there. He cleaned his brushes each evening. This was necessary maintenance. Brushes were expensive. He could not afford to let them be ruined by dried paint. He cleaned them carefully, working the paint out of the bristles, rinsing them in solvent, then in water, then hanging them to dry. The next morning, they would be ready to use again. He stretched his own canvases when he could afford to buy canvas and stretcher bars. This saved money compared to buying pre-stretched canvases. He measured. He cut. He stretched the canvas tight across the wooden frame. He sized it, applying a layer of glue to seal the canvas, to prevent the oil paint from soaking through and rotting the fibers. He waited for the sizing to dry. Then he applied a ground, a layer of white paint that would provide a surface to paint on. All of this took time. Time that was not spent painting. But it was necessary work. Part of being a painter. Part of maintaining the ability to continue working. Money ran low. He counted the coins he had left. He calculated how many more days they would last. He looked at the canvases in his room and wondered which one might sell, which one someone might want to buy. He took one or two to a small gallery that sometimes handled his work. The gallery owner looked at them, shook his head, usually. Said they were difficult to sell. Said people did not understand them. Said he would try, but could not promise anything. Occasionally, someone bought one. Usually for very little money. Less than Monet had hoped. But something? Enough to buy more paint. Enough to pay the rent for another few weeks. Enough to continue. The financial instability created a particular kind of anxiety. Not dramatic. Not panicked. But constant. A low, steady worry that was always present. Even on good days. Days when the painting went well. Days when he felt he was understanding something new. The worry was there underneath. The knowledge that his money was running out. That he would need to sell something soon. That he might not be able to. He tried not to let this anxiety affect the work. When he was painting, he tried to focus only on what was in front of him. The light, the colors, the relationships between tones, the way to suggest depth, the way to capture movement. But the anxiety leaked in sometimes. He would be painting and suddenly remember that he needed money for rent. He would be mixing a color and suddenly worry about how much paint he was using, whether he could afford to use this much. The tension between making art and surviving was constant during these years. He could not resolve it. He could not find a way to do both easily. He had to choose, over and over, to keep painting, even when it meant living in poverty, even when it meant going without things that others took for granted, even when it meant facing rejection and criticism and the judgment that his work was not good enough, not finished enough, not valuable enough. The academic institutions continued unchanged. The salon continued to set standards. The jury continued to accept certain kinds of work and reject other kinds. The official art world continued to define what painting should be, what subjects were worthy, what techniques demonstrated skill. Monet existed outside this system. Not by choice, exactly. He had submitted his work. He had tried to engage with the official channels. But his work did not fit. It was rejected more often than it was accepted. And even when it was accepted, it was misunderstood, described as unfinished, criticized for the very qualities that Monet considered essential. He could have changed his approach. He could have tried to paint in a way that would be more acceptable to the jury. Smoother surfaces. More conventional subjects. More careful finish. Many painters did this. They adapted their work to match what the system rewarded. It was practical. It was sensible. It was how you built a career. But Monet could not do it. Or would not do it. The distinction was unclear. He had learned something on the beaches with Boudin. He had learned that painting could be about observation, about light, about capturing a moment. That lesson had gone deep. It had shaped how he saw. He could not unsee it. He could not pretend that the official subjects interested him more than the light on the river. He could not pretend that smooth finish mattered more than the immediate response to a changing scene. So he continued in the way he had been continuing. Painting outside. Painting quickly. Painting what he saw. Submitting to the salon and being rejected. Living in poverty. Struggling to sell his work. Enduring criticism. Facing the constant pressure to give up, to find a more practical way to make a living, to admit that what he was trying to do was not valued by the world as it existed. But he did not give up. Each morning he woke. Each morning he gathered his materials. Each morning he went out into Paris and looked at the light and tried to paint it. The routine continued. The work continued. The rejections continued. The financial struggles continued. The criticism continued. Nothing was resolved. The academic institutions did not change their minds about his work. Collectors did not suddenly begin to value paintings that looked unfinished. Critics did not suddenly understand what he was trying to do. The salon jury did not suddenly accept that blue shadows in snow paintings were accurate observations rather than mistakes. Monet continued to submit paintings. He continued to hope for acceptance. He continued to experience rejection. He continued to retrieve his paintings and bring them back to his room and look at them and wonder what the jury had seen, what they had objected to, whether he should have painted differently. But he did not paint differently. The next painting was similar to the last painting. Another view of the river. Another bridge. Another scene of ordinary light falling on ordinary subjects. Another quick response to a particular moment. Another canvas covered with visible brushstrokes, textured paint, colors placed beside each other rather than smoothly blended. The tension was not dramatic. It did not create crisis or collapse. It was simply ongoing. A steady pressure. The knowledge that what he was doing was not valued. That the official world of art did not have a place for his work. That he was working at the margins, outside the system, without support or recognition or the possibility of security. He continued anyway. Because the light continued to change. Because the river continued to flow. Because each morning brought new conditions, new effects, new moments that seemed worth trying to capture. Because the work itself, regardless of whether it was accepted or sold or understood, felt necessary. Felt like the only thing he knew how to do with complete honesty. The days accumulated. Weeks became months. Months became years. The pattern repeated. Paint, submit, be rejected, retrieve the painting, continue painting. Walk through Paris, observe the light, set up the easel, paint what he saw. Clean the brushes, stretch canvases, count the remaining coins, worry about money, continue working. Other painters he knew were having more success. They had found ways to work within the system. Their paintings were accepted by the salon. They received commissions. They began to sell their work for reasonable prices. They moved to better rooms. They ate better food. They bought better materials. They began to feel that a career in painting was possible, that their years of study and practice were leading somewhere. Monet watched this happening around him. He was happy for his friends when they succeeded. But he also felt the weight of his own continued struggle. The sense that he was being left behind. That his commitment to painting light, to capturing moments, to working quickly and roughly, was preventing him from achieving the kind of success that others were achieving. But he could not change. The work had its own logic, its own necessity. He was following something, not a plan, not a clear path to success, but a sense that this was what painting could be for him, a way of engaging with the world, a way of looking and seeing and trying to record what he saw with as much honesty as he could manage. The tension remained unresolved. The academic standards remained unchanged. The salon jury remained skeptical of his work. Critics remained convinced that his paintings were unfinished. Collectors remained uninterested. The financial struggle remained constant. And Monet remained committed to the work, to the daily practice of going out and looking and painting, to the attempt to capture light, to the willingness to be rejected and to continue anyway, to the long, slow process of learning to see, learning to paint, learning to trust that what he was doing mattered, even when no external validation confirmed this. The routine continued. Morning after morning. Season after season. The river flowed. The light changed. The city moved through its rhythms. And Monet stood with his easel, painting, trying to understand, trying to capture, trying to translate the experience of seeing into paint on canvas. Without resolution, without clarity, without certainty about whether he was succeeding or failing, whether he was moving towards something or simply marking time, whether the work he was making would ever be valued or would remain forever misunderstood, unsold, rejected by the official institutions that determined what art was and what art should be. He continued painting. The Franco-Prussian War disrupted life in France. It was not a disruption that arrived all at once. Wars do not work that way. They begin somewhere, with declarations and movements of troops, with news that travels through cities and towns, with rumors and reports, and the slow gathering sense that ordinary life is ending, that something else is beginning. Monet was in Paris when the war began. He had been living there, painting there, struggling there. The city had been the center of his work for years. He knew its streets, its river, its light. He had painted the same bridges and embankments over and over, watching how they changed with the seasons, with the weather, with the hour of the day. But now, the city was changing in a different way. The change was not about light or weather. It was about the movement of history, of politics, of forces much larger than any individual painter or painting. The war was between France and Prussia. It was about territory, about power, about the question of which nation would dominate Central Europe. These were grand abstractions. They had nothing to do with painting, nothing to do with the daily work of trying to capture light on canvas. But they affected everything anyway. They disrupted the rhythms of ordinary life. They made it impossible to continue as before. Men were called to military service. Shops closed. Food became scarce. The atmosphere in the city changed. People walked through the streets with different expressions. There was worry. There was uncertainty. There was the sense that the future had become unpredictable, that plans made yesterday might be meaningless tomorrow. Monet left France during this period. The decision to leave was not simple. France was his home. Paris was where he worked, where his friends were, where the art world existed. To leave meant abandoning all of that, at least temporarily. It meant going somewhere else, somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere he would have to begin again. But staying seemed impossible. The war was disrupting everything. The conditions for painting were deteriorating. The city was no longer safe, no longer stable. Young men who stayed were at risk of being conscripted, of being sent to fight in a war that might last months or years, that might end in victory or defeat, that might end in death. He made arrangements. He packed what he could carry. His painting materials. A few canvases. Some clothes. Not much. Everything had to be portable. Everything had to fit into what he could manage to transport. He left Paris. He traveled. The journey itself was difficult, disorienting. The infrastructure of travel was disrupted by the war. Trains ran irregularly. Routes were uncertain. Everything took longer than it should have taken. Everything was more expensive than it should have been. He went to the Netherlands. He stayed there from May to October of 1871. 6 months. Half a year. A substantial period of time, but also temporary, unsettled, defined by the knowledge that this was not permanent, that he was here only because the war had made it impossible to be elsewhere. The Netherlands was different from France. The landscape was different. Flat, open, defined by water. Canals cut through the countryside in straight lines. Windmills stood against the sky, their blades turning slowly in the wind. The light was different too. It came across the flat land without interruption, without the varied terrain that created different qualities of light in different locations. During this time, he painted small scenes of windmills and canals. Small scenes, not grand compositions, not ambitious works meant to impress the salon jury or attract important collectors. Just small paintings of what he saw around him. Windmills standing beside water. Canals reflecting sky. The simple architecture of the Dutch countryside. He painted because that was what he did. Because even in displacement, even in a foreign country during a time of war and uncertainty, painting was the activity that gave structure to his days, that connected him to himself, that felt necessary. The windmills were different from anything he had painted before. They were structures he was not familiar with, forms he had not studied or drawn repeatedly. He had to learn them. Learn their proportions, their silhouettes, the way they looked from different angles, the way their blades caught the light. The canals were more familiar. Water was water. It reflected the sky. It moved or was still. It changed with the light. These were things he understood from painting the Seine, from all those hours standing beside the river in Paris, watching, observing, trying to capture the particular color and quality of water under different conditions. But the Dutch canals were not the same. They were narrower, more controlled. They ran in straight lines rather than meandering. The water was often still, creating perfect reflections. The banks were precise, maintained, part of a landscape that had been shaped by human effort over centuries. He set up his easel beside these canals. He looked. He painted. The routine was familiar, even if the location was not. The same process. Observing the light. Mixing colors. Applying paint to canvas. Building up the surface stroke by stroke. Working quickly because the light was changing, because the moment he was trying to capture would be gone soon. Monet continued working despite displacement. This was important. The war had disrupted his life. He was in a foreign country. He did not speak the language fluently. He did not know the people. He did not have his studio, his familiar places, his network of friends and fellow painters. He did not have the life he had built in Paris over the preceding years. But he continued working. He painted. Not as much as he would have liked, perhaps. The conditions were difficult. He was unsettled. He was worried about the war, about what was happening in France, about when he would be able to return, about what he would find when he returned. But he painted anyway, because painting was what he knew how to do, because it was the one constant, the one thing that remained the same even when everything else was changing. because the act of setting up an easel and looking at light and trying to translate what he saw into paint was something he could do anywhere, even here, even now, even in the middle of displacement and uncertainty. The daily routines were unsettled during these months. There was no established pattern, no familiar studio to return to, no known streets to walk through, no regular locations where he went to paint. Everything was new. Everything required figuring out. He was living somewhere, in rented rooms presumably, though the specific details of where he stayed and how he arranged his life are not part of what is known. But he had to have some place. Some room where he could sleep, where he could store his materials, where he could look at the paintings he had completed. Living conditions were unsettled. Not dangerous, perhaps. Not dramatically harsh. But uncertain. Temporary. Marked by the knowledge that this was not home, that this was a pause, an interruption, a waiting period until the war ended and it became possible to return to France. He woke each morning in a place that was not his place. He looked out windows that showed him a landscape he was still learning. The flat Dutch countryside. The canals. The windmills. The particular quality of Dutch light coming across open land. He gathered his materials. The same materials he had used in France. The same brushes, the same palette, the same basic equipment. These traveled with him. They were constant, even when everything else changed. The feel of the brush in his hand was familiar. The weight of the canvas on the easel was familiar. The smell of the paint and turpentine was familiar. He walked out into the Dutch countryside. He looked for subjects. This was different from Paris, where he had known exactly where to go, which bridges to paint, which stretches of the river held the most interest. Here he had to explore. He had to wander. He had to find places that seemed worth painting. The windmills drew his attention. They were everywhere in the landscape. Tall structures, functional, working machines that had nothing to do with art or beauty, but were simply there to grind grain, to pump water, to serve the practical needs of agriculture and land management. But they had visual interest. Their forms were strong against the sky. Their blades created patterns as they turned. They stood as markers in the flat landscape, giving the eye something to focus on, something to measure distance against. He painted them small. These were not large, ambitious canvases. They were modest in scale. Studies, perhaps, though he did not think of them as studies. They were simply paintings. Records of what he saw. Attempts to capture the particular quality of a Dutch windmill in Dutch light. The canals were easier in some ways. Water was something he understood. He had painted water for years. He knew how to suggest reflection, how to capture the way the surface of water held the image of the sky and the trees and the buildings along its banks. He knew how to paint the subtle movement of water, the way ripples distorted the reflections, the way still water created almost perfect mirror images. But these canals also presented new challenges. The Dutch light was different from French light. It had a different quality. The atmosphere was different. The colors were different. The way light interacted with water here was not quite the same as the way it interacted with water in the Seine. He had to adjust. He had to observe carefully. He could not rely entirely on what he had learned in France. He had to look at this water, this light, these particular conditions, and respond to them directly. This was good practice, in a way. It reinforced what he had always believed about painting, that you could not work from formulas or recipes, that you had to look at what was actually in front of you and respond to that each scene required its own approach, its own set of decisions about color and tone and how to build up the surface. But it was also difficult. He was working without the support system he had in Paris. No friends to paint alongside. No one to discuss problems with. No familiar dealers or galleries. No possibility of submitting work to the salon. He was isolated, working alone, painting for himself, for the sake of continuing to paint, without any clear sense of what would happen to these paintings, whether anyone would ever see them or value them. The months passed slowly. May, June, July. The summer unfolded. The weather changed. Some days were clear. Some days were overcast. Some days, rain fell across the flat landscape, blurring everything, making it impossible to paint outdoors. On those days, he stayed inside. He looked at the paintings he had completed. He cleaned his brushes. He stretched new canvases if he had the materials. He waited for the weather to clear. August, September. The summer began to fade into autumn. The light changed. It became softer, more golden. The quality of late afternoon light was particularly beautiful, coming across the flat land at a low angle, making everything glow, making the ordinary landscape look momentarily extraordinary. He painted when he could. He continued working. But there was always the awareness of displacement. The knowledge that he was here because he could not be there. That he was painting Dutch windmills and canals because he could not paint the Seine. Because Paris was disrupted by war. Because ordinary life had been interrupted by forces beyond his control. He thought about France. He thought about what was happening there. News traveled slowly. Reports were unreliable. He did not know the full extent of what was happening. He did not know how the war was progressing, whether France was winning or losing, how long it might continue. He thought about his friends. The other painters he had known in Paris. Where were they? What were they doing? Had they also left? Had they stayed? Were they safe? There was no way to know. Communication was difficult. Letters might or might not arrive. Months might pass before he received any news. The uncertainty was constant. He was living in suspension. Not quite here, because this was not home. Not quite there, because there was inaccessible. Existing in a temporary state, waiting for something to resolve, for the war to end, for the possibility of return to open up again. The painting helped. It gave him something to do. It gave him a way to structure his days. It gave him a reason to get up in the morning, to go outside, to pay attention to the world around him, even though he was displaced, even though he was uncertain about the future, even though everything felt temporary and unsettled. He set up his easel beside a canal. He looked at the water. He looked at the windmill reflected in the water. He looked at the sky. He mixed his colors. He began to paint. For those hours, while he was working, the displacement receded slightly. Not entirely. It was always there, in the background. But the immediate task of painting, of observing and responding and trying to capture what he saw, took precedence. It occupied his attention fully. The brushstrokes accumulated. The painting developed. He worked quickly, as he always worked when painting outdoors. The light was changing. The sun was moving across the sky. The reflections in the water were shifting. He had to capture this moment before it became a different moment. When he finished, or when the light had changed too much to continue, he stepped back. He looked at what he had painted. Sometimes it felt successful. Sometimes it did not. Sometimes he had managed to capture something of what he had seen, the particular quality of the light, the feeling of standing beside that canal at that hour. Sometimes the painting felt empty, inadequate, a failure to translate seeing into paint. He packed up his materials. He carried the wet canvas carefully, holding it so the paint would not smudge. He walked back to wherever he was staying. He placed the canvas somewhere to dry. He cleaned his brushes. He looked at the other paintings he had completed during his time in the Netherlands. They accumulated slowly. A record of these months. A record of displacement. A record of continuing to work despite everything. October arrived. The war was not over, but something changed. It became possible to return. Or perhaps he simply decided to return regardless of whether it was safe, regardless of whether conditions had improved. He could not stay in the Netherlands indefinitely. He needed to go home. He needed to return to France, to Paris, to the life he had been living before the war disrupted everything. He gathered his paintings. He packed his materials. He prepared to travel again. The journey back would be difficult, like the journey away had been difficult. Nothing about travel during wartime was easy or certain, but he was going back. He was ending this period of displacement. He was returning to begin again in a place that would be changed, that would not be the same as it had been before the war, but that was at least his place, the place where he belonged. The Dutch paintings were small records of these months. They were not his most important work. They were not paintings that would define his career or establish his reputation. They were simply what he had painted while he was there, while he was away from home, while he was waiting for the war to end. But they mattered. They represented continuity. They showed that even in displacement, even in uncertainty, even in a foreign country during a time of war, he had continued to paint. He had continued to observe light. He had continued to set up his easel and look and try to capture what he saw. The academic questions had not changed during these months. The salon still existed. The official standards still defined what painting should be. The jury still rejected work that did not meet their criteria. All of that was still there, waiting, unchanged by the war, unchanged by his displacement. When he returned to France, he would return to the same struggles. The same difficulty selling his work. The same financial instability. The same rejection by the official institutions. The same criticism that his paintings were unfinished. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing had changed in the fundamental relationship between his work and the art world that judged it. But he had continued painting. Through the disruption, through the displacement, through the months in a foreign country, he had not stopped. He had not given up. He had adapted to new conditions, found new subjects, continued the daily work of observing and painting. This persistence was its own kind of answer. Not an answer to the question of how to succeed within the official system. Not an answer to the question of how to sell paintings or gain acceptance by the salon. But an answer to the question of what it meant to be committed to painting. What it meant to continue regardless of circumstances. What it meant to believe that the work mattered enough to keep doing it, even when everything else was uncertain. The flat Dutch landscape had taught him new things about light. The way light moved across open land. The way reflections appeared in still canal water. The way windmill blades caught the light as they turned. These were additions to his knowledge, small increments in the long, slow process of learning to see, learning to observe, learning to translate observation into paint. But they had not resolved anything. He was still working outside the academic tradition. He was still painting in a way that official institutions did not value. He was still producing work that looked unfinished to critics, that was difficult to sell, that did not fit the established categories of what painting should be. The displacement was ending. The months in the Netherlands were concluding. He was preparing to return. But return to what? To the same struggles, to the same uncertainty, to the same daily work of trying to paint light while living in poverty, while facing rejection, while existing at the margins of the official art world. The war had disrupted his life. It had forced him to leave. It had taken him to a foreign country. It had given him months of unsettled living, of painting in unfamiliar conditions, of existing in suspension, waiting for the possibility of return. But it had not changed the fundamental nature of his work. He was still painting the same way. Still observing light. Still working quickly. Still leaving his brushstrokes visible. Still choosing ordinary subjects. Still producing paintings that the official world did not know how to value. He packed the Dutch paintings with his other materials. Small canvases showing windmills and canals. Records of these months of displacement. They would travel with him back to France. They would join the other paintings in whatever room he found to live in, whatever space he could afford once he returned. They would accumulate with the rest of his work, unsold, unexhibited, unrecognized by the institutions that determined what mattered in the art world. But they existed. They had been painted. They represented hours of looking, of observing, of trying to understand how light worked in this particular place. They were part of the ongoing work, the daily practice, the long, slow accumulation of paintings that documented his commitment to trying to capture light, trying to paint truthfully, trying to respond directly to what he saw, rather than what he was told he should see. The journey back approached. He would leave the Netherlands. He would return to France. He would find a place to live. He would begin again. He would continue painting. The river would still be there. The bridges would still be there. The light would still be changing. The seasons would still be turning. And he would still be setting up his easel, looking, trying to understand, trying to capture something that was always moving, always changing, always just beyond his ability to fully grasp. The displacement was ending. But the work was not ending. The work continued. It would continue through return, through re-establishing himself in Paris, through facing again all the difficulties and rejections and struggles that had defined his life before the war. It would continue because continuing was what he did. Because painting was what he knew. Because observing light was what mattered to him more than anything else, more than success or recognition or the approval of the official institutions that had no place for his work. The Dutch light faded into memory. The windmills remained behind. The canals remained behind. He carried the paintings with him, physical records of the time he had spent there, but the place itself receded. He was moving forward. Or perhaps not forward, but simply continuing. Continuing to paint. Continuing to observe. Continuing to work despite displacement, despite uncertainty, despite everything that made painting difficult and the future unclear. The war had disrupted life in France. He had left. He had stayed in the Netherlands for 6 months. He had painted small scenes of windmills and canals. He had continued working despite displacement. These facts were the structure of this period. But beneath them was the ongoing work, the daily practice, the commitment to painting that persisted through war and displacement and all the uncertainty that came with them. Nothing was resolved. The academic world would not accept his work when he returned. Critics would not suddenly understand what he was trying to do. Collectors would not suddenly value paintings that looked unfinished. The salon jury would not suddenly see that visible brushstrokes and ordinary subjects and quick responses to changing light were legitimate artistic choices rather than failures to master proper technique. He would return to struggle, to poverty, to rejection, to the constant pressure to conform or to give up, to the daily work of painting without external validation, without support from the institutions that determined what art was and what art should be. But he would return to painting, to the river, to the light, to the ongoing attempt to understand how to capture a moment, to the work that mattered to him, regardless of whether it mattered to anyone else. The displacement had been temporary. The work was permanent. Or as permanent as anything could be, as permanent as his commitment to it, as permanent as his willingness to continue regardless of circumstances, regardless of success or failure, regardless of whether anyone ever understood or valued what he was trying to do. Monet painted Impression Sunrise in the early 1870s. It was a painting of Le Havre Harbor, the place where he had grown up, where he had learned to see light with Boudin, where he had first understood that painting could be about observation, about atmosphere, about capturing a moment rather than constructing a permanent image. He had returned to Le Havre. Not permanently. Just to paint. To look at the harbor again. To see how it appeared now, after years away. After years of painting in Paris, after years of learning and struggling and trying to understand how to capture light. The harbor was the same. The same masts rising against the sky. The same water moving with the tide. The same buildings along the waterfront. The same working atmosphere of a port city. Ships coming and going, cargo being loaded and unloaded, the daily business of commerce and maritime trade. But Monet saw it differently now. He had more experience. He had painted hundreds of scenes. He had learned things about color, about how to suggest atmosphere, about how to work quickly to capture a fleeting effect. He brought all of this accumulated knowledge to the harbor. He painted at dawn. The sun was rising. The sky held that particular quality of early morning light, when the darkness has just lifted, but the full brightness of day has not yet arrived. The water reflected the sky. Orange and blue mixed together. The sun appeared as a bright disk, its light creating a vertical path across the water, a streak of orange that led from the horizon to the foreground. The painting was built quickly. Rapid brushstrokes. Visible marks. Colors placed beside each other, overlapping, suggesting forms rather than defining them precisely. In the foreground, small boats appeared as dark silhouettes. In the background, masts and cranes and buildings emerged faintly through the morning haze. Everything was soft, atmospheric, held in the particular light of that moment. He called it Impression Sunrise. The title acknowledged what the painting was. Not a detailed rendering of Le Havre harbor. Not a careful documentation of every mast and building. But an impression, a quick response to a particular quality of light at a particular moment. The feeling of standing at the harbor at dawn, watching the sun rise through the mist. The painting was exhibited publicly. This happened sometime after it was painted. Monet and a group of other painters had organized their own exhibition. They had grown tired of submitting to the Salon and being rejected. Tired of waiting for the official institutions to accept their work. Tired of painting according to someone else's standards and still being told their work was inadequate. So they decided to exhibit independently. To rent space and hang their own paintings and invite the public to come see them. It was a practical decision. If the Salon would not show their work, they would show it themselves. They would create their own opportunity to be seen. The exhibition included work by multiple painters. Monet was one of them. Others included Renoir, Sisley, Pissarro, Degas, Berthe Morisot. Painters who had been working in similar ways, exploring similar ideas about light and color and quick observation, painting scenes from contemporary life rather than historical or mythological subjects. They hung their paintings in the rented space. They opened the doors to the public. They waited to see how people would respond. The painting, Impression Sunrise, hung among the others. It was modest in size. It did not dominate the exhibition. It was simply one painting among many, all of them showing the same rough surfaces, the same visible brushstrokes, the same focus on light and atmosphere, rather than careful finish and elevated subjects. People came to the exhibition. Critics came. The public came. They walked through the rooms, looking at the paintings. And they did not understand what they were seeing. The response included criticism and misunderstanding. Critics wrote about the exhibition. Their reviews were not favorable. They saw the rough surfaces and the visible brushstrokes, and they saw incompetence. They saw paintings that looked unfinished, that looked like sketches, that looked like the painters had not learned proper technique or had been too lazy to complete their work. One critic took the title of Monet's painting, Impression Sunrise, and used it mockingly. He wrote about the exhibition as a show of impressionists, meaning painters who only gave impressions, who did not finish their work, who created vague suggestions rather than clear statements. He meant it as an insult, as a way of dismissing the work, of saying it was not real painting, not serious art. The term impressionism emerged from this critical response. The word was created as mockery. It was meant to diminish, to suggest that these painters were not producing finished work, but only rough impressions, that they were not serious artists, but practitioners of some lesser form, something quick and careless and inadequate. But the term stuck. The painters themselves began to use it, not because they agreed with the critics' dismissive intent, but because it actually described something about what they were trying to do. They were trying to capture impressions, quick responses to light, immediate perceptions of a scene, the feeling of a moment, rather than a permanent monument. So the word that had been meant as an insult became the name of what they were doing. It became the term that would eventually be used to describe an entire movement, a significant shift in how painting could be understood, a new approach to art that valued observation and immediacy over classical principles and careful finish. But none of that was clear at the time. At the time, it was just mockery. Just another way that critics expressed their disappointment and confusion when looking at work that did not meet their expectations. Just another voice saying that Monet and his colleagues were not real painters, that their work was not valuable, that they had failed to learn what they should have learned. Monet did not receive immediate recognition or financial success from the exhibition. The exhibition did not change his circumstances. It did not lead to sales. It did not attract collectors who suddenly understood and valued his work. It did not result in commissions or invitations or the kind of support that would have made it possible to live more comfortably, to paint without constant financial worry. The paintings hung in the exhibition. People saw them. Critics wrote about them dismissively. And then the exhibition ended. The paintings were taken down. Monet carried his paintings back to wherever he was living. The impression, Sunrise, returned to being just another canvas among the many canvases he had accumulated over years of work. Financial instability continued after the exhibition. Nothing had changed. He still struggled to pay rent. He still struggled to buy painting materials. He still ate simple meals, bread and cheese, whatever was cheap and available. He still counted coins, calculated how many more days they would last, wondered how he would continue. The exhibition had required money to organize. Renting the space cost money. Printing announcements cost money. All the logistics of mounting an independent exhibition cost money. The painters had pooled their resources, each contributing what they could, but none of them had much. They were all struggling. They were all hoping the exhibition would lead to sales, to recognition, to some change in their circumstances. It did not. The exhibition attracted attention, but not the kind of attention that led to financial support. It attracted critics, who wrote dismissive reviews. It attracted some members of the public, who came to look and laugh, who found the rough paintings amusing or baffling, who could not understand why anyone would paint this way. A few people understood. A few people looked at the paintings and saw something interesting, something new, something worth paying attention to. But they were rare. They were not enough. They were not the collectors with money to spend, not the influential critics who could shape public opinion, not the gallery owners who could provide steady support. Monet returned to his daily routine. He woke in his small room. He gathered his materials. He walked through Paris to the places where he painted. He set up his easel. He looked at the light. He painted. The routine had not changed. The exhibition had been a moment, a brief interruption in the ongoing work. But the work continued as it had always continued. Daily. Persistent. Driven by the need to paint, the need to observe light, the need to try to understand how to capture a moment on canvas. He painted the river. The same stretches of the Seine he had painted before. The same bridges. The same embankments. The light was always different. The water was always different. Each day brought new conditions, new effects, new challenges. He painted in different weather. On clear days, when the light was bright and the colors were saturated. On overcast days when everything was muted, held in a narrow range of grays and soft tones. On days when rain threatened, when the air felt heavy, when the light had a strange quality, both dim and intense. He painted in different seasons. The spring light, soft and new. The summer light, warm and golden. The autumn light, richer, more saturated. The winter light, cool and clear, and somehow sad. Each painting was an attempt to understand something about color, about how colors related to each other, about how to suggest depth without using traditional perspective, about how to capture the movement of water, the way reflections broke up into fragments, the way the surface held images and released them, constantly shifting. The work accumulated, canvas after canvas. Some felt successful. Some did not. Some captured something close to what he had been trying to capture. Some fell short, missed the quality he had been reaching for, felt empty or false, or disconnected from the living moment he had been observing. He continued anyway. Each failure was part of the process. Each painting, whether successful or not, taught him something, added some small increment to his understanding, helped him see a little more clearly, mix a color a little more accurately, respond a little more quickly to what was in front of him. The financial struggle shaped everything. He could not afford to paint as much as he wanted to paint. Materials were expensive. Canvas cost money. Paint cost money. Brushes wore out and had to be replaced. Each painting represented money spent, money he might not recoup if the painting did not sell. He had to be careful. He had to choose his subjects carefully. He had to work on smaller canvases than he might have preferred. He had to stretch every franc, make every tube of paint last as long as possible, clean and reuse brushes until they were worn down to nothing. Other painters he knew were beginning to have more success. Not all of them. Most were still struggling. But some had found ways to sell their work, had attracted patrons, had begun to build small but steady incomes. They could afford better rooms, better food, better materials. They could paint more freely, without constantly calculating the cost of each canvas, each tube of paint. Monet watched this happening around him. He was not bitter, exactly. He was glad when his friends succeeded. But he also felt the weight of his own continued poverty, his own continued rejection by the official art world, his own inability to find buyers for his work. The impression, Sunrise, sat among his other paintings. It did not feel particularly important. It was one painting among many. He had painted it quickly, in response to a particular morning at Le Havre Harbor. He had titled it simply, acknowledging that it was an impression rather than a finished statement. And then it had been exhibited and criticized and mocked, and now it sat in his room like all the other paintings that had not sold, that had not attracted interest, that existed as records of his work, but not as sources of income or recognition. He did not know that the painting would later be considered important, that it would be seen as the work that gave a name to an entire movement, that the term Impressionism, coined in mockery, would become one of the most significant terms in art history, that his quick response to dawn light at Le Havre Harbor would be remembered and valued when many more carefully finished academic paintings were forgotten. He could not know any of that. He was living in the present, in the daily struggle to continue painting despite poverty and rejection, in the constant work of trying to understand light, trying to capture atmosphere, trying to respond honestly to what he saw. Monet continued working without knowing the future significance of the movement. He painted because painting was what he did, because observing light was what interested him, because the work itself, regardless of whether it was understood or valued by others, felt necessary, felt like the only honest way he knew to engage with the world. He walked through Paris in the early morning. The city was quiet. The light was cool and clear. He noticed how it fell across buildings, how it created long shadows, how it made familiar streets look different, transformed by the particular quality of dawn light. He walked through Paris at midday. The city was busy. People filled the streets. The light was high overhead, even, less dramatic than morning or evening light, but still worth observing. Still teaching him something about how light worked when it came from directly above, how it changed the appearance of forms, how it flattened some things and revealed others. He walked through Paris in late afternoon. The light was changing, becoming warmer. The shadows were lengthening. The atmosphere of the city was different at this hour. People moved more slowly. The energy of midday was fading. Evening was approaching. He walked through Paris at dusk. The light was almost gone. The sky held color long after the sun had set. Violet and deep blue, sometimes orange or pink, near the horizon. Windows began to glow from within. The city transformed, became softer, quieter, more mysterious in the fading light. All of these observations accumulated. All of these hours of looking, of paying attention, of noticing how light changed everything. They were the foundation of his work. The patient observation that came before painting. The willingness to look, really look, at what was happening in the air, in the atmosphere, on the surfaces of buildings and water and streets. The academic institutions continued unchanged. The salon continued to define what painting should be. The jury continued to accept certain kinds of work and reject others. The official art world continued to value smooth finish and elevated subjects and careful composition according to established principles. Monet's work did not fit these criteria. The exhibition had not changed that. The mockery from critics had not changed that. Nothing had changed except that now there was a name for what he and his colleagues were doing. Impressionism. A term that had been meant as an insult, but that described something real about their approach. But having a name did not make the work more acceptable to the official institutions. It did not make critics understand or appreciate what they were trying to do. It did not make collectors want to buy their paintings. It was just a word, a label. It did not change the fundamental reality that Monet was still working outside the system, still painting in a way that official art world did not value, still struggling to survive while pursuing work that might never be recognized or rewarded. He continued to submit paintings to the salon, not every year, but sometimes. The hope never entirely disappeared. The possibility that the jury might accept something, that one painting might be hung in the official exhibition, that some door might open that would lead to recognition, to sales, to the ability to continue working without constant financial terror. Most submissions were rejected. He would receive the notice. Brief. Impersonal. His work had not been selected. He would retrieve the painting, carry it back through the streets, look at it again, wonder what the jury had seen, what they had objected to, whether there was any way to paint that would satisfy both his own sense of what was true and their sense of what was acceptable. He could not find such a way. The gap was too large. What he valued, what seemed important to him about painting, was precisely what the jury rejected. The quick response. The visible brushstrokes. The focus on light and atmosphere rather than clear narrative or elevated subject matter. The willingness to leave things suggested rather than fully defined. These qualities were central to his work. They were not accidents or failures. They were intentional choices, the result of years of observation and practice, the outcome of what he had learned on the beaches with Boudin, what he had developed through countless hours of painting outdoors, trying to capture moments that were always changing. But they were also the reasons his work was rejected. The reasons critics called his paintings unfinished. The reasons collectors did not want to buy them. The reasons he continued to live in poverty despite years of dedicated work. The tension did not resolve. The exhibition had not resolved it. The emergence of the term Impressionism had not resolved it. Monet continued to exist in the gap between what he knew to be true about painting in what the official world valued and rewarded. He painted the river on a spring morning. The water was calm. The trees along the bank were just beginning to leaf out. The light was soft, diffuse, the particular quality of spring light, gentle and new. He worked quickly, trying to capture the feeling of the morning, the freshness, the sense of renewal that came with the season. He painted the river on a summer afternoon. The water was bright, reflecting the intense blue of the sky. The foliage was full and heavy. The light was warm, golden, creating strong contrasts between sun and shadow. He worked fast, the paint almost wet when he applied new strokes over previous ones, building up the surface, trying to suggest the density of summer growth, the weight of the light. He painted the river on an autumn evening. The light was fading. The leaves were turning. The water held the last color of the sky, violet and deep blue. The air was cooler. The atmosphere was changing. He painted quickly, knowing the light would be gone soon, knowing this moment would pass and not return in quite this way. Each painting was different. Each one captured particular conditions. Each one was an attempt to understand something about how light worked, how color worked, how to translate the experience of seeing into paint on canvas. The work continued, day after day, season after season. The routine provided structure, even when everything else was uncertain. Even when money ran out. Even when rejection came again. Even when critics wrote dismissively about exhibitions. Even when the official art world continued to ignore or mock what he was doing. He continued because the work itself mattered. Because the light continued to change. Because the river continued to flow. Because each morning brought new conditions, new effects, new moments that seemed worth trying to capture. Because painting was what he knew how to do, what felt necessary, what connected him to the world in a way that felt honest and true. The impression sunrise had been painted. It had been exhibited. It had been mocked. A term had emerged from that mockery. A name for what Monet and his colleagues were doing. Impressionism. A word that would later carry weight and significance and historical importance. But none of that mattered in the daily work. In the morning routine of gathering materials and walking to the river and setting up the easel and looking at the light. In the practical challenges of mixing the right color, placing the right stroke, building up the surface quickly enough to capture a moment before it passed. In the ongoing struggle to continue painting despite poverty, despite rejection, despite the constant pressure to give up or to conform to standards that felt false. He painted. He continued painting. Without knowing what would come, without knowing whether his work would ever be valued. Without knowing whether the movement that would later be called Impressionism would matter, would be remembered, would change how people understood painting. He worked in the present, in the immediate experience of standing beside the river, looking at light, trying to understand, trying to capture, trying to respond honestly to what he saw. The future was unknown. The past was full of rejection and struggle. The present was painting. The daily work. The ongoing attempt to see clearly and to translate that seeing into something visible, something that existed, something that recorded the fact that he had stood in this place at this moment and had looked and had seen and had tried to capture what he saw, however inadequately, however roughly, however different it might be from what anyone else expected or wanted painting to be.